They're calling it peace, but with every handshake, there's a threat. With every proposal comes rejection. Right now, in May 2026, the ceasefire between the United States and Iran is dying, and everyone is watching to see who pulls the trigger first. To understand what's happening today, we need to go back to March. That's when this war officially started, but the roots go much deeper. The tension between Washington and Tehran has festered for decades. Ideological opposition, competing regional interests, proxy wars fought in Lebanon, Gaza, Syria. Then, in early 2026, escalation turned into full-blown conflict. Within weeks, American and Israeli forces were striking Iranian targets. Hundreds died. Then something unexpected happened. Negotiations began. By late April, a ceasefire was announced. The world held its breath. But here we are 3 weeks later. The ceasefire isn't holding. It's fraying. Today, the Strait of Hormuz remains blockaded. Oil tankers are being redirected, shipping corridors are disrupted, and the talking has turned to threats.
Let's break down what actually happened. Iran presented a 14-point peace proposal to Washington. It was comprehensive, addressing nuclear programs, sanctions, regional disputes, military postures. Iran's parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, declared the U.S. had no alternative but to accept it. President Trump disagreed. He called it totally unacceptable. He went further. He said the ceasefire was on life support with only a 1% chance of survival. His language was blunt. The proposal was, in his words, a piece of garbage. So what went wrong? The sticking points are numerous. Iran wants sanctions relief, not just partial, but comprehensive. They want access to frozen assets worth billions. They want recognition of their nuclear right to peaceful energy. They want guarantees against future strikes. The U.S. demands are different. Washington wants Iran to dismantle its ballistic missile program. It wants absolute assurances on nuclear capabilities. It wants the Strait of Hormuz open immediately. It wants regime changes in Iran's regional policies, reduced support for groups designated as terrorist organizations by the West. These aren't minor disagreements. These are fundamental positions. But here's where it gets complicated. Inside Iran, there's internal division. Some factions support negotiations. Others are hardliners who see any compromise as surrender. The same exists in Washington. Republicans backing Trump, but Democrats are pushing for withdrawal through another war powers resolution vote. This internal fragmentation on both sides is paralyzing the negotiations.
Now, let's talk about what's really driving this. Oil, specifically the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow 21-mile corridor between Iran and Oman is the world's most critical choke point for energy security. Roughly 30% of all seaborne oil passes through it daily. That's millions of barrels per day. Right now, Iran has closed it off to Western shipping. The blockade is deliberate. It's leverage. Every day the strait remains closed, global oil prices tick upward. Brent crude is trading around $104 a barrel. Just a month ago, it was significantly lower. This has consequences that ripple across the Western economy. Americans are paying more at the pump. Diesel prices are surging. Shipping costs increase, which means goods on store shelves cost more. Inflation accelerates. Trump has authorized the release of 53 million barrels from America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve to stabilize markets. But it's a Band-Aid solution on a structural problem. Here's the strategic calculation. Iran knows this. By maintaining the blockade, they're imposing economic pain on the West while maintaining military readiness. They're signaling that negotiations without meaningful concessions won't work.
Meanwhile, the U.S. is preparing for the opposite scenario. Trump's advisors are reportedly weighing expanded military options. If diplomacy fails, the logic goes, military escalation becomes the only lever left. This is where hidden assumptions matter. Trump administration officials believe Iran has fractured leadership, that decision-making is paralyzed between moderates and hardliners. If that's true, military pressure might force a more unified Iranian response. If it's false, military escalation could trigger the very regional conflagration everyone's trying to avoid. For Europe and the UK, this is an energy security crisis. They're not dependent on Middle Eastern oil like they were decades ago, but they're vulnerable to price spikes. A full-scale war would devastate their recovery from post-pandemic inflation. Canada's watching this through an energy lens, too. Higher oil prices globally can actually benefit Canadian producers, but global economic instability is never good for long-term growth.
The implications extend far beyond the Middle East. In the United States, a majority of Americans now blame Trump for the war and the economic pain it's causing. This is politically significant. The cost of living is rising. Wages aren't keeping pace. Unemployment remains low, but wage growth is stagnating because energy costs are eating into household budgets. Democratic senators are using the War Powers Resolution to try to stop the conflict, but Republicans control Congress. It's a stalemate. Meanwhile, Israel is escalating operations in Lebanon. Over 1.1 million Lebanese have been displaced. Israeli strikes are claiming civilian lives, children, elderly, medical workers. The EU, which had been fractured on Middle East policy, finally agreed on sanctions against Israeli settlers in the West Bank. This is significant because it signals European governments are losing patience with the broader regional conflict.
And let's talk about Russia and China. Russia is benefiting from oil price spikes. It helps their economy. But a full-scale U.S.-Iran war could pull American attention away from Ukraine, potentially giving Moscow more room to maneuver. China is concerned about energy security. Most of its oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz. A prolonged conflict threatens Chinese economic growth. Beijing is quietly pushing for a negotiated settlement, but their influence in this particular conflict is limited. Iran itself is in a difficult position. The Islamic Republic faces internal pressure, young people protesting, economic stagnation, isolation. Yet accepting a weak peace deal could delegitimize the regime with hardliners. So Iran takes a hard negotiating stance publicly, all while facing domestic pressure to find a resolution. The United Kingdom and Canada are watching from the sidelines, concerned about energy prices, concerned about regional stability, but unable to directly influence the outcome. They're aligned with the U.S., but there's unease in London and Ottawa about whether this war was necessary and whether it's winnable.
Here's what we're actually witnessing: the collision of two irreconcilable views of Middle Eastern security. The Trump administration sees Iran as a revisionist power that cannot be contained through diplomacy. It views military pressure as the only language Tehran understands. From this perspective, any agreement made with Iran will eventually be broken, so why negotiate at all? Iran, conversely, sees itself as a regional power defending its sovereignty against Western encroachment. From Tehran's perspective, the U.S. has violated agreements before. It withdrew from the nuclear deal in 2018. Why should they trust American promises now? Both sides have legitimate historical grievances. Both sides are acting rationally from their own perspective, but that rationality is creating irrational outcomes, a war neither side fully wants, but neither side knows how to stop.
The economic impact is real. If this conflict extends beyond summer 2026, global recession becomes probable. Supply chains will fragment further. Insurance premiums on shipping will spike. Developed economies will face stagflation, rising prices with stagnant growth. Developing nations will be devastated. Countries that depend on oil imports will face crippling energy bills. Food prices, already elevated from previous crises, will surge further. And the human cost in the Middle East continues to accumulate. Lebanon is becoming a proxy battleground. Gaza remains devastated. Syria remains fractured. The humanitarian toll is immense. So where does this end? In the coming weeks, watch 3 things. First, whether the Strait of Hormuz remains blockaded. If Iran lifts the blockade, negotiations might resume. If they maintain it, expect military escalation. Second, watch the EU. European governments are slowly shifting their position. If they formally abandon support for U.S. military action, it signals a major geopolitical realignment. Third, watch the oil market. It's the early warning system. When oil prices spike, war is likely. When they stabilize, peace might be possible. This isn't just another Middle Eastern conflict. It's a test of whether great powers can coexist in a multipolar world, or whether we're entering an era of permanent great power friction. The ceasefire isn't dead yet, but it's on life support. What happens next will define the next decade of global politics. What do you think will happen? Let me know in the comments. And if you want deep analysis on the forces reshaping our world, subscribe for more.